Okay, last part, C. I want to find the x-coordinate on the curve where the tangent line is vertical. Okay, so what this means is we have two pieces of information that have to be satisfied. The first is we have to be on the curve, and the second is the tangent line has to be vertical. So a vertical tangent line means that the slope is undefined. And on the curve means that we satisfy that initial equation, which was 3xy squared minus x squared y equals 18. So let's think about what causes a slope to be undefined. That occurs if we are trying to divide by 0. So if we come back up here to the slope, we can see that if this denominator equals 0, then we're going to get an undefined slope. So we're going to create a system of equations involving this denominator and this curve because we have to satisfy both. So we can write down we want to find the values of x for which 6xy minus x squared equals 0. That was the denominator of my slope. And we're on the line, or on the curve, excuse me. So when we look at this, elimination is not going to work. Because elimination doesn't work, that means our other option is to do substitution. So let's be smart about how we substitute. The goal is to find the x coordinate. So when I substitute, I should end up with an equation that has x in it, simply because that will save me time. So that means in one of these equations, I should try and isolate y so that I can then plug it into the next equation. Well, this one has two different y's, and one of them squared, the other one isn't, so isolating in the bottom is probably going to be rough. But if we look at the top, we can isolate that y and get an x squared over a 6x, which in this case is going to be an x over a 6. So I can now replace that and get a 3x times an x over 6 squared minus an x squared times an x over 6. That should equal 18. Now I'm going to take just a little bit of a detour here and look at this again, because we did a bit of a no-no here when we were isolating x. We tried to divide by a 6x, and dividing by a variable typically is not allowed. So let's see what's really going on here. Here I had something that equals 0. So if 6xy minus x squared equals 0, then that's the same as saying x times a 6y minus an x had to equal 0. There are two ways that that can happen: if x equals 0 or if y equals that x over 6. If we examine the x equals 0 and plug it into the curve, we can see that we would get a 0 minus a 0 equals 18. That generates no points on the curve, so we can't use it. The other one is what we've ended up plugging in right here. So if I plug in that x over 6, then I can multiply this all out. Notice the whole fraction is squared. So I have a 3x times an x squared gives me a 3x cubed, and on the bottom I have a 36. Then over here I have another x cubed, only this time I'm over 6. To get a common denominator, I could multiply by 6, and I don't have a calculator, so I have to somehow solve this without a calculator. Well, since I've got a common denominator, I can now combine my tops. 3x cubes minus 6x cubes gives me a negative 3x cubes over 36 equals 18. So because I want to isolate the x cubed, I'm going to move this 36 to the other side. And I'm not going to waste time multiplying it out because I'm eventually going to have to take a cube root. So instead I will move the negative 3 over, which will give me a negative 6 times a 36, which is a 6 times 6. So now when I take the cube root to isolate the x, I will actually get a negative 6. So my x coordinate ends up being x equals negative 6. So let's look at how the points were allocated. The first point came from setting the denominator of the slope equal to 0. So just writing that down will get you 1 point. The next point comes from isolating your y, either in the factored form or here, and figuring out that y is going to be x over 6. And once you have found that, to get the second point, you have to plug that into the equation of the curve. Since we're trying to solve the system, you're getting 1 point for doing that substitution method. Then your final point is to crank through the algebra and end up with x equals -6.